So, hello and welcome back as we dive back into another journey through the public domain works. This time we are reading Beverly of Graustark by George Barr McCutcheon, and this is where I do have to apologize to any massive book purists because this is where I'm going to deviate a little bit from the way it is written because the character of Aunt Fanny, who is introduced in this chapter, is written in a really racist and very disparaging light. And I just can't do it. I'm I'm going to basically just translate the stuff because the way she's written is just it's it's not nice. I mean, it's things like instead of "we'll soon be there, Miss Beverly," which is the way I plan on reading it, to "we soon be dar, Miss Beverly." And that's just yeah. So if you would like, imagine it that way, but I just am not going to read it that way. I That's the one thing I really hate about reading these older books is a lot of the portrayals of anyone that's not white and usually white and male is done in an extremely disparaging way. And, that's where you as the reader either skips over that part, which I do in a lot of older books, or you just sort of translate it in your head to something that's not quite so icky and racist. So, letting you know going forward that the character of Aunt Fanny is not going to be read exactly as written. I'm just gonna kind of make her sound less ignorant because that's what I'm gonna do. So, with all of that being said, and without any further ado, let's jump back into Beverly of Graustark by George Barr McCutcheon. Probably reading 2 chapters, but no guarantees. We'll see where we're at after chapter 3, which is where we are going to begin with chapter 3, On the Road from Balak. A ponderous coach lumbered slowly, almost painfully, along the narrow road that skirted the base of a mountain. It was drawn by 4 horses, and upon the seat sat 2 rough, unkempt Russians, one holding the reins, the other lying back in a lazy doze. The month was June, and all the world seemed soft and sweet and joyous. To the right flowed a turbulent mountain stream, boiling savagely with the alien waters of the flood season. Ahead of the creaking coach rode 4 horsemen, all heavily armed. Another quartet followed some distance in the rear. At the side of the coach, an officer of the Russian mounted police was riding easily, jangling his accoutrements with a vigor that disheartened at least one occupant of the vehicle. The windows of the coach doors were lowered, permitting the fresh mountain air to caress fondly the face of the young woman who tried to find comfort in one of the broad seats. Since early morn she had struggled with the hardships of that seat, and the late afternoon found her very much out of patience. The opposite seat was the resting place of a substantial colored woman and a stupendous pile of bags and boxes. The boxes were continually toppling over, and the bags were forever getting under the feet of the placid servant whose face, quite luckily, was too dark to reflect the anger she was able otherwise, through years of practice, to hide. Yeah, that's a little racist. "How much farther have we to go, Lieutenant?" asked the girl on the rear seat plaintively. The man was very deliberate with his English. He had been recommended to her as the best linguist in the service at Radovich, and he had a reputation to sustain. "In another hour is but yet," he managed to inform her with a smile. "Oh, dear," she sighed. "A whole hour of this?" "We will soon be there, Miss Beverly. Just you make up your mind to rest easy, and we—" But the faithful old woman's advice was lost in the wrathful exclamation that accompanied yet another dislodging of bags and boxes. The wheels of the coach had dropped suddenly into a deep rut. Aunt Fanny's growls were scarcely more potent than poor Miss Beverly's moans. "It's getting worse and worse," said Beverly. "I'm black and blue from head to toe, aren't you, Miss Fanny?" "I can say that I am blue, Miss Beverly. Hit those monstrously bad roads, that's definitely what's happening. Stay up there, won't you?" she concluded, jamming a bag onto the upper corner. Miss Calhoun, tourist extraordinaire, again consulted the linguist in the saddle. She knew at the outset that the quest would be hopeless, but she could think of no better way to pass the next hour than to get a little bit of information from the officer. "Now for a good old chat," she said, beaming a smile on the grizzled man. "Is there a decent hotel in the village?" she said. They were on the edge of the village before she succeeded in finding out everything that she could, and it wasn't very much either. She learned that the town of Balak was in Axphion, scarcely a mile from the Graustark line. There was an eating and sleeping house on the main street, and the population of the place did not exceed 300 people. When Miss Beverly awoke the next morning, sore and distressed, she looked back upon the night with a horror that sleep had been kind enough to interrupt only at intervals. The wretched hostelry lived long in her secret catalogue of terror. Her bed was not a bed. It was a torture. The room, the table, but it was all too odious for description. Fatigue was her only friend in that miserable hole. Aunt Fanny had slept on the floor near her mistress's cot, and it was the good old woman's grumbling that had awoken Beverly. The sun was climbing up the mountains in the east, and there was an air of general activity around the place. Beverly's watch told her that it was past 8 o'clock. "Oh, good gracious," she exclaimed. "It's nearly noon, Aunt Fanny. Hurry along here and get me up. We must leave this abominable place in 10 minutes. She was up, racing around excitedly. "Before breakfast," said Aunt Fanny. "Goodness, Aunt Fanny, is that all you think about?" "Well, you be thinking about mighty seriously, wow, it's really hard to translate this. Well, my dear, you would be thinking a lot seriously about breakfast around 11 o'clock. That little stomach of yours will be powerfully mad at you if you don't." "Oh, very well, Aunt Fanny. You can run around and have the woman put up a breakfast for us, and we'll eat it on the road. I positively refuse to eat another mouthful in that awful dining room. I'll be down in 10 minutes. Beverly was down in less. Sleep, no matter how hard-earned, had revived her spirits. She pronounced herself ready for anything. There was a wholesome disdain for the rigors of the coming ride through the mountains in the way that she gave the orders for them to start. The officer met her just outside the entry to the inn. He was less English than ever, but he eventually gave her to understand that he had secured permission to escort her as far as Ganlook, a town in Graustark, not more than 15 miles away from Edelweiss, and at least 2 days away from Balak. Two competent Axphaerian guides had been retained, and the party was quite ready to start. He had been warned of the presence of brigands in the wild mountainous passes north of Ganlook. The Russians could go no farther than Ganlook because of a royal edict from Edelweiss forbidding the close approach of any armed forces. At that town, however, he was sure she could easily obtain an escort of Graustarkian soldiers. As the big coach crawled up the mountain road and further into the oppressive solitude, Beverly Calhoun drew from the lieutenant considerable information concerning the state of affairs in Graustark. She had been eagerly awaiting the time when something could be learned. Before leaving St. Petersburg early that week, she had been assured that a state of war did not exist. Princess Yetive had been in Edelweiss for 6 weeks, and a formal demand was framed soon after she had returned from America, requiring Dawsbergen to surrender the person of Prince Gabriel to the authorities of Graustark. To this demand, there had been no definite response, Dawsbergen insolently requesting time in which to consider that proposition. Axphain immediately sent an envoy to Edelweiss to say all friendly relations between the two governments would cease unless Graustark took vigorous steps to recapture the royal assassin. On one side of the unhappy principality, a strong, overbearing princess was egging Graustark on to fight, while on the other side, an equally aggressive people defied Yetive to come and take the fugitive if she could. Poor Yetive was between two ugly alternatives, and a conflict seemed inevitable. At Balak, it was learned that Axphain had recently sent a final appeal to the government of Graustark, and it was no secret that something like a threat had accompanied the message. Prince Gabriel was in complete control at Saros, and he was disposed to laugh at the demands of his late captors. His half-brother, the dethroned Prince Dantan, was still hiding in the fastnesses of the hills, protected by a small company of nobles, and there was no hope he would ever regain his crown. Gabriel's power over the army was supreme. The general public admired Dantan, but it was helpless in the face of all these circumstances. "But why should Axphain seek to harass Graustark at this time?" said Beverly, in perplexity and wrath. "I should think that the brutes would try to help her." "There is an element of opposition to the course of the government's taking," said the officer, "but it is greatly in the minority. The Axphains have hated Graustark since the last war, and the princess despises this American. It is an open fact that the Duke of Mizrox leads the opposition to Princess Volga, and she is sure to have him beheaded if she can. He is friendly to Graustark, and he has been against the policy of this princess from the start." "Why, I'd like to hug the Duke of Mizrox," said Beverly. The officer did not understand her, but Aunt Fanny was scandalized. "Oh, good Lord," Aunt Fanny muttered to the boxes and bags. As the coach rolled deeper and deeper into the rock-shadowed wilderness, Beverly Calhoun felt an undeniable sensation of awe creep over her. The brave, impetuous girl had plunged gaily into the project which now led her into the deadliest of uncertainties, with but little thought of consequences. The first stage of the journey by coach had been great fun. They had passed along pleasant roads, through quaint villages, and among interesting people, and the progress had been rapid. The second stage had presented rather terrifying prospects, and the third day, that promised to be even worse. Looking from the coach windows out upon the quiet, desolate grandeur of her surroundings, poor Beverly began to appreciate how abjectly helpless and alone she was. Her companions were ugly, vicious-looking men, any one of whom could inspire terror just by looking at them. She had entrusted herself to the care of these strange creatures in the moment of inspired courage, and now she was constrained to regret this action. True, they had proven worthy protectors as far as they had gone, but the very possibilities that lay in their powers were quite appalling now that she had time to consider her situation. The officer in charge had been recommended as a trusted servant of the Tsar. An American consul had secured the escort for her direct from the frontier patrol authorities. Men in high power had vouched for the integrity of the detachment, but all this was forgotten in the mighty solitude of these mountains. She was beginning to fear her escort more than she feared the thieves in the hills. Treachery seemed printed on their backs as they rode up ahead of her. The big officer was ever polite and alert, but she was ready to distrust him on the slightest excuse. These men could not help knowing that she was rich, and it was reasonable for them to suspect that she was carrying money and jewels with her. In her mind's eye, she could picture these traders rifling through her bags and boxes in some dark pass, and there were other horrors that almost petrified her when she allowed herself to think of them. Here and there, the travelers passed by rude cots where dwelt woodmen and mountaineers, and at long intervals a solitary but picturesque horseman stood aside and gave them the road. As the coach penetrated deeper into the gorge, the signs of human life and activity became fewer. The sun could not send his light into this shadowed tomb of granite. The rattle of the wheels and the clatter of the horses' hooves sounded like a constant crash of thunder in the ears of this poor tender traveler, this dainty morsel amongst the hawks and wolves. There was an unmistakable tremor in her voice when she at last found the heart to ask the officer where they were to spend the night. It was far past noon, and Aunt Fanny had suggested opening the lunch baskets. One of the guides was called back, the leader being as much in the dark as his charge was. "There is no village within 20 miles, he said. "We must sleep in the past." Beverly's voice faltered. "Out here? In all this awful—" Then she caught herself. It came to her suddenly that she must not let these men know she was apprehensive. Her voice was a trifle shrill, and her eyes glistened with a strange new light as she went on, changing her tactics completely. "How romantic! I've often wanted to do something like this." The officer looked bewildered and said nothing, and Aunt Fanny was speechless. Later on, when the lieutenant had gone ahead to speak with the guides about the suspicious actions of a small troop of horsemen that they had seen, Beverly confided to her old nurse that she was frightened almost all the way out of her boots, but that she would die before these men should see a sign of cowardice from a Calhoun. Aunt Fanny was not so proud. It was with great difficulty that her high-strung young mistress suppressed the wails that had long been held under restraint in Aunt Fanny's lungs. "Good Lord, Miss Beverly, they'll chop us to pieces, and they'll take our jewelry and money and clothes and everything else that we have around. Good Lord, please let's turn back, Miss Beverly. We don't have any way to do anything out here in these mountains, and be still, Aunt Fanny, said Beverly with a fine show of courage. You must be brave. Don't you see we can't turn back? It's as dangerous and a heap sight more. If we let on that we're not one bit afraid, they'll respect us, don't you see? And men never harm a woman that they respect. Humph, said Aunt Fanny with an exaggerated sense of irony. Well, they never do, said Beverly, who wasn't quite all that sure about it. And they look like real nice men, honest men, even though they have such terrible whiskers. They are the worst trash I've ever seen, said Aunt Fanny. Shush, don't let 'em hear you. In spite of her terror and her perplexity, Beverly was compelled to smile. It was all so like the farce comedies that you would see in the theater, she thought. As the officer rode up, his face was pale in the shadowed light of the afternoon, and he seemed very nervous. Well, what's the latest news from the front? Said Beverly. The men refused to ride on. He said that quickly, making it quite hard for her to understand through his accent. Our advance guard has met a party of hunters from Axphain. They insist that you, the fine lady in the coach, are Princess Yetive, returning from a secret visit to St. Petersburg, where you went to ask for assistance from the Tsar. Beverly Calhoun gasped in astonishment. It was too incredible to believe. It was actually ludicrous, and she laughed. How very silly. I am well aware that you are not Princess Yetive, he said. But what can I do? The men won't believe me. They swear they have been tricked, and they are panic-stricken over this entire situation. The hunters tell them that the Axphain authorities, fully aware of the hurried flight of the princess through these woods, are preparing to intercept her. A large detachment of soldiers have already been dispatched across the Graustark frontier. It is only a question of time before the Redlegs will be upon them. I have assured them that their beautiful charge is not the princess, but an American girl, and that there is no mystery about the coach and the escort. But it's all in vain. The Axphain guides already feel that their heads are on the block. Well, as for the Cossacks, not even my dire threats of the awful anger of the Tsar when he finds they've disobeyed his command will make them move. Oh, speak to your men once more, good sir, and promise them big purses of gold when we reach Ganlook. I have no money or valuables with me, but there I can get plenty, said Beverly, shrewdly thinking it better that they believe her to be without funds in the mountains. The cavalcade had halted during this speech. All of the men were up ahead, conversing sullenly and excitedly with very much gesticulation. The driver, a stolid creature, seemingly indifferent to everything that was going on, was the only one that remained at his post. The situation, apparently dangerous, was definitely most annoying. But if Beverly could have read the mind of that silent figure in the box, she would have felt at least slightly relieved, for he was infinitely more anxious to proceed than even she was, but for different reasons. He was a Russian convict who had escaped on the way to Siberia. Disguised as a coachman, he was seeking life and safety in Graustark or any out-of-the-way place, and it mattered little to him where the escort concluded to go. He was going ahead. He didn't dare go back. He had to keep going on. At the end of about half an hour, the officer returned, and all hope had left his face. "It is useless," he cried. "The guides refuse to proceed. See? They're going off with their countrymen, and we're lost without them. I don't know what to do. We cannot get to Ganlook. I don't know the way, and the danger is great. Huh, madam, here they come. The Russians are going back." As he spoke, the surly mutineers were riding slowly towards the coach. Every man had his pistol on the high pommel of his saddle, and their faces had an ugly look. As they passed the officer, one of them, pointing ahead of him with his sword, shouted savagely, "Balak!" It was conclusive and convincing. They were deserting her. "Oh, the cowards!" sobbed Beverly. "I must go on. It is possible that even such men could leave me." She was interrupted by the voice of the officer who, raising his cap to her, commanded at the same time that the driver turn his horses and follow the escort to Balak. "What is that?" said Beverly. From far away came the sound of firearms, and Beverly heard a dozen shots fired, reverberating down through the gloomy pass. "They're fighting somewhere in the hills ahead of us," said the now frightened officer. Turning quickly, he saw the deserting horsemen stop, listen for a moment, and then spur on their horses. He cried out sharply to the driver, "Come here, turn around, we have no time to lose." With a savage grin, the hereto motionless driver hurled some insult at the officer who was already following his men, now in full flight down the road, and setting himself firmly on the seat, taking a fresh grip on the reins, he yelled to the horses, at the same time lashing them furiously with the whip, and started the coach ahead at a fearful pace. His only thought was to get as far as possible from the Russian officer, and then to deliberately desert the coach and all of its occupants, and then he'd head for the hills. And that is the end of chapter 3. I'm going to gather my thoughts and we'll talk. Okay, so I actually am enjoying this story so far. The caveat to that being the character of Aunt Fanny. That's gonna be a hard one to swallow, because she is definitely written extremely ignorantly, and sometimes it would be hard for me to read her lines out loud even as they're written, because they're just, it's not even the racism in them, it's they don't make sense. Like, instead of "Good Lord, Miss Beverly," they'll chop us all to pieces and take our jewelry and money and clothes and everything else that we have got about us. "Good Lord, let's turn back, Miss Beverly. We don't have nothing out here in these mountains." It was written as, "Good Lord, Miss Beverly, they'll chop us all to pieces and take our jewelry and money and clothes and everything else we done got about us. Good Lord, let's turn back, Miss Beverly. We ain't got no mo' show out here in these mountains than That's, yeah, that's a mouthful, even as written, and trying to translate it into something that I'm more comfortable saying out loud is going to be a challenge, but I feel like I'm up to it, because I feel like the character of Aunt Fanny so far, she's probably a very wise woman, and she probably was right. They probably should have just turned around there, because it sounds like they're riding into trouble with no one to help them. That being said, I am enjoying the story. I'm getting a very interesting picture of Beverly as being kind of a spoiled little rich girl, a little bit naive, a little bit silly. It's hard to believe that she's supposed to be in her 20s, because she feels very young in her characterization so far, but that might just be because she's been very sheltered her whole life. So, aside from the way Aunt Fanny is written, I feel like she's also going to be a very vital piece in this story. I did also find out that the movie version does differ very substantially from the written version, so I am going to be looking forward to seeing that when we finish this book. Also, it's almost Christmas, so I think I'm probably going to do one chapter, unless it's very short, at least throughout the next week. We'll see what comes after that. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you stay, even if I am going to deviate on the character of Aunt Fanny at least a little bit. And yeah, leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile. And I will see you tomorrow.